Hi, everyone. Today we are talking about how much genetics will influence your results, the three somatotypes or body types where that concept originated, and if you should train based on your body type. And I'll leave you with tips if you are struggling with body recomposition. So if you're struggling either in the fat loss department or if you're struggling to gain muscle or both. So how can two people do the exact same program yet look so different? Is it all genetics? Should you train differently based on your body type? I talk about the science of body recomposition all the time. And basically, it comes down to lifting close to failure to build muscle and nutrition for fat loss. But what you will constantly see on the internet is people doing the opposite, not training close to failure and claiming that they're eating in a calorie surplus or whatever it is to achieve their physique. So, how much of their results are genetics? Turns out for some people, genetics will largely influence their results. Some people don't need to follow the science that works for the majority of the population. There are outliers. They may be able to do programs that simply won't work for the majority of us because their genetic predisposition to gain muscle and lose fat is really high. So they can really do much of anything, or they don't have to do much of anything to see pretty good results. The reality is genetics do play a role, and for some people, genetics play a larger role than for others. Here's what some of the science says about how much genetics influence your results. So one twin study that looked at over 300 postmenopausal women showed that lean mass is about 30 to 50% genetic. Another smaller twin study across a wider age range, so the participants were anywhere from 19 years old to 62 years old, showed that lean body mass was about 77% genetic and fat mass was about 65% genetic, so a little bit on the higher end. So the range of how much genetics influence your body composition seems to be very large. Realistically, it's probably very individualized, with some individuals being primarily driven by genetics and others may have a much larger window of opportunity for lifestyle to play a role in their fitness results. But what we do know is that lifestyle changes can make up anywhere from 30-ish to 70% of the equation. Yes, genetics will influence things like bone shape, fat gain or fat loss tendencies, and muscle gain or muscle loss tendencies. And genetics also do affect metabolism. But we have quite a bit of control despite our genetic predisposition. For example, muscle preservation and muscle gain largely depends on proper strength training, protein, not just genetics. And the more muscle you build, the more you positively control your metabolism. You slightly increase your basal metabolic rate, but you also positively influence hormones in the way of improving glucose storage and insulin sensitivity. These things will have a compounding effect on your body composition over time. So it's not just genetics. Hormones may also have a large genetic component, but again, much of our hormone, quote unquote, balance is determined by lifestyle. For example, testosterone, which yes, women have testosterone and need testosterone because it allows you to build lean mass, is largely genetic. One study showed it was anywhere from 44% to 59% genetic. However, lifestyle factors like lack of sleep reduces testosterone, making it harder to build muscle even if you are training and eating in the right ways. On the other hand, we can increase testosterone and have quite a bit of control there and therefore improve our results through proper resistance training, high quality and quantity of sleep, and even getting enough sunlight. Another example of a hormone that is largely under our control but still has a major impact on our body composition is cortisol. One way cortisol rises is when we are sleep deprived and or combining a super low calorie diet with a lot of exercise at the same time. This creates an anti-recomposition environment in which it becomes difficult to gain muscle and or lose fat. So doing the right things, sleeping well, a proper resistance training routine, sunlight, eating enough but not overeating, not undereating, all these things are crucial for our bodies despite your somatotype, despite your genetic predispositions. So yes, genetics set the potential, and I'm not going to say that they don't matter. And for some people, honestly, they matter more than for others. But habits do ultimately determine our outcome, and we have quite a bit of control. So understanding all of this and how genetics play a role, should you train differently given your genetic body type? Maybe you've heard of somatotypes, and there are three. So the first one is an ectomorph. This somatotype is lean, low body fat, narrow shoulders, narrow hips. They have difficulty gaining muscle or difficulty gaining weight. The second is mesomorph. So this body type is muscular, athletic, broader shoulders, and they gain muscle pretty efficiently. And the final is endomorph. Endomorphs have wider frames, typically higher body fat percentage, and they gain weight easily. The origin story of somatotypes is fascinating, and I want to discuss it because it highlights how the fitness industry often latches on to non-scientific terms in order to make their programs more marketable. The three somatotypes or body types were created from William Sheldon, an American psychologist in 1940, to correlate human physical characteristics to personality traits. According to him, not only do these body types determine how you look, but your physiological tendencies and behavior traits. So ectomorphs tend to be more introverted and intellectual, mesomorphs assertive and energetic, and endomorphs sociable and relaxed. Obviously, this has received a lot of criticism and is not scientifically accurate and is discredited in modern psychology. Yet, it remains a popular way to classify people in the fitness industry and is used to tailor fitness programs based on your body type. The fitness industry has latched onto these types, probably in an attempt to sell their program, make their programs more marketable in order to appeal to our desire to classify ourselves into categories, despite there being very little scientific validity behind these. The reality is that there's a wide spectrum of body types, and classifying yourself into one of these body types may not be super useful, as I'll discuss in today's episode. So this takes me to the question, should you train differently based on your body type? Again, I don't think it's very useful to classify yourself into one of these body types because the recommendations for nutrition and training, if body recomposition or gaining muscle and or losing fat are your goals, the recommendations are going to be largely the same regardless of your quote unquote somatotype. Also, science shows that there's a spectrum of body types, and it's much more useful to train and eat based on an individual approach rather than from a category. Science also shows that your body type is not always predictive of how you will respond to training. For example, someone may classify themselves as an ectomorph, but put on muscle relatively easily and actually display tendencies of a mesomorph when they train correctly. So I'll quote one study. There was no significant relationship between somatotype and fitness, but there was a significant relationship between macronutrient intake and fitness, meaning your body type did not necessarily predict your fitness outcomes, but nutrition and training will more strongly predict your fitness outcomes. So instead of taking an online quiz, which may categorize you into one of these somatotypes and recommend training and diet based on that. For example, they may say endomorphs need more cardio and mesomorphs don't need to strength train very much. Train and eat for your goals and adjust elements of your training and nutrition as needed on an individual level. You will see so much more success. If your goal is muscle gain, eat at maintenance or even in a slight surplus, like 200 calories over your maintenance, with 0.75 to 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight per day. This is all recommended by Hope Brandt, the registered dietitian that we work with. As far as training, you want to train each muscle group close to failure in 30 reps or less in each set. And we do this in Evlo if you need help with the programming. And then you want to just stay overall active with about 150 minutes of cardio per week outside strength training. And that can be adjusted slightly more or slightly less, kind of depending on how you're feeling, your lifestyle, and your recovery. If your goal is body recomposition, so fat loss while gaining or maintaining muscle, it's the same training and protein recommendation, but now your calories will change a little bit. So you'll eat either in a slight deficit, or so like 200 to 400 calories is what Hope recommends, or just at your maintenance calories. Again, adjusting based on your outcomes. Try something, see if it's working, and then adjust based on that. If fat loss is your goal, it's the exact same recommendation as it is for body recomposition because you're in a calorie deficit, which is required for fat loss. So if you're in a calorie deficit and you're not eating high protein and you're not strength training properly, you will lose both muscle and fat, which is not what we want. So we want to at least maintain your muscle mass when you are trying to lose fat. So you want to eat enough protein and strength train while staying in a small but sustainable calorie deficit. Again, anywhere from 200 to 400 calorie deficit. Let's say you're doing all of these things and you're struggling to either build muscle or you're struggling to lose fat. What should you do? Here are some tips. Let's start with if you're struggling with muscle gain. Number one, try lifting heavier for fewer reps. Science shows that you need to perform anywhere from 6 to 30 reps and take every set close to failure for muscle growth. Most people are simply not getting close enough to failure, even though they feel like they are. You're potentially being stopped by the burn or fatigue or boredom or discomfort. You're not being stopped or limited by the muscle. You know you're close to failure when your rep speed slows significantly. Your last rep should be slow and hard. If you think you're about to perform your last rep, one test to try is to try to lift the weight as quickly as possible. If you physically cannot lift it quickly, you're probably close enough to failure. If you can try your hardest and you can lift that weight pretty quickly, you probably either need to go up in weight in the second set or do more reps until you are close to failure. If you're struggling to build muscle, try lifting heavier for fewer reps, because again, I think a lot of people are stopped from the burn or boredom, or they're like, okay, I'm going to do 15 reps, and they get to that 15 rep, but their last rep is not close to failure. That's why we don't count reps, because rep schemes are just very arbitrary. So you might be being stopped because of all of those things, not because the muscle is the limiting factor. So if you lift a bit heavier for fewer reps, it pretty much ensures that you are going to approach that muscular failure point, and it reduces the risk of accumulating a bunch of fatigue. Higher reps tend to be more fatiguing, and it reduces the risk of accumulating a bunch of metabolites and being stopped by the burn. So again, if you're struggling to build muscle, increase your weight more and decrease your reps. And you can do this in any Evlo class. And if you need to stop sooner than we do in the class, totally fine. You get to just take a little break, which can be super effective anyways, because then you'll feel fresher going into your next set. My second tip, if you're struggling to build muscle, is to choose more stable exercises. So let's say you're training your glutes and you're struggling to get close to failure in your glutes before maybe your back stops you, or you're overall tired, or you feel the burn and you're stopped by the burn, or you're stopped by your grip strength. In other words, you stop the exercise for other reasons, but you feel like your glutes had more to give. This is when you swap an exercise for something that's really stable and go a little bit heavier with that lift for fewer reps. For example, instead of doing a Bulgarian, which is a little less stable, right? You're on one leg, you have some balance and coordination demands. We use a wall, which takes a lot of that out. But if you're using weights in both hands, or even if you're not, even if you're using the wall, you still have to contend with a little bit of balance. You have to contend with quite a bit of trunk load. You have to contend with your grip strength, holding a heavy weight. So you may feel like all of those things are stopping you before your glutes are stopping you. So instead, you could try swapping out a more stable exercise like a hip thrust, or our clamshell pluses that we've been doing, or even a half deadlift, where you have more support of the ground or a prop, and therefore you can fully focus on the muscle instead of being distracted by all of these other elements. So feel free to swap exercises as you need to. The irony is, once you get strong in some of those exercises and you're starting to build muscle and strength, you might go back to something like a Bulgarian and feel like you can do it more effectively and feel less limited by all those other things. And then my third tip is to maybe eat on the higher end of that protein scale. Again, Hope recommends 0.75 to 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight per day. I personally find the best results when I eat 1 gram per pound of body weight per day, or even more. And there's some interesting literature coming out recently that indicates that you could potentially eat more than 1 gram per pound of body weight per day and still see great muscle growth. So you may just need to be on the higher end of that spectrum and really increase your protein more. And then my final tip is to work each muscle twice a week. If you're an Evlo member, this doesn't apply to you because we're programming everything, so you don't have to worry about it. But training a muscle twice a week seems to be a sweet spot where you aren't overtraining, but the muscle is getting consistent stimulus. Make sure to keep 48 hours in between. If you're an Evlo member, again, you don't have to worry about any of this. So if you're doing all these things, you're like, check, 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 check. I've tried all of these things and I'm still not seeing muscle growth. First of all, visible muscle growth can take up to 3 months. So if you're still not seeing any change by 3 months, you've implemented these changes and it's been 3 months, you're still not seeing really any change, you could start by getting your hormones checked or going to a provider who can assess you one-on-one. We recently had an Evlo member say, I was doing all of these things and I felt like I wasn't recovering very well. Like I just wasn't seeing any change. She got her hormones checked and found that her testosterone was very low. So once they started to address those things, she started noticing, oh my gosh, I'm recovering so much better. I'm doing the exact same workouts, but I'm finally starting to see results. So I caution against jumping right to this as a solution before you try those other things, because odds are you might have to go back and do those other things eventually anyways, even if it is a hormone imbalance. So do the other things because you're going to do those things anyways. And then if you need to, go to a provider to get something checked out. Next, let's talk about tips if you're struggling to lose fat. My first recommendation if you're struggling to lose fat is to not shy away from building muscle. If you do struggle with fat loss, building lean mass will improve your ability to lose fat over time due to improvements in insulin sensitivity and muscle's small increase in resting metabolic rate. Building muscle is not the only thing responsible for fat loss. Fat loss happens when you're in an energy deficit or in a calorie deficit, but it does play a role. One mistake that people make is cutting calories way too low and adding a lot of exercise, specifically adding a lot of cardio. And as I said before, this tends to backfire, leading to binges, sleep disturbances, and studies show that when you're in a severe calorie deficit, your RMR, your resting metabolic rate, and your basal metabolic rate decrease. So your metabolism can slow to account for the decrease in energy coming in. You also tend to get hungrier, which makes it nearly impossible to stay in a calorie deficit. So this just really isn't a very effective approach. So if fat loss is your goal and you're struggling with it, resistance train. You don't need to go crazy on the cardio, because if you're overdoing it, again, you can increase your stress, reduce recovery, get worse sleep, get hungrier. All of that can backfire. But you do want to stay active. Don't shy away from the cardio either. I think aiming for around 150 minutes of cardio outside your strength training workouts is awesome. Again, you can adjust that maybe up or down depending on how you're feeling and how you're recovering. And then as far as food, our RDs recommend a small calorie deficit, maybe 200 to 400 calorie deficit per day. You also really want to focus on sleep if you're struggling with fat loss, because lack of sleep affects hunger hormones and can greatly decrease the chances of you losing fat. So go to bed at the same time, try to wake up at the same time, aim for, 7 to 9 hours of sleep every single night. Consistency with sleep is really, really important. One night of sleep, a poor sleep here and there is not going to make a huge difference, but overall, we really need to have that good sleep hygiene. You may also, another tip is that you may need to track your calories more precisely. People say they're tracking and maybe are, but also are not accounting for the things that tend to add up. So maybe they're cooking with oils and not adding the oils, or having a glass of wine at night and not adding that, or not adding sauces or things that they don't think have a lot of calories in them, but it can add up. And those things can add up to be, 100, 200, 300 calories per day. And when you're in a small deficit, that's your window of opportunity of change. So you might not be seeing fat loss because you're just not tracking precisely enough. And I know that tracking is contentious. Some people don't like to do it, but if you are struggling with fat loss, it is a great, great tool. And being precise with it, especially in the beginning, can be really useful. Again, if you're doing all of these things and you're not seeing results, when is it time to see a provider? So fat loss happens a lot quicker than muscle gain. Muscle gain is more of a long-term thing, whereas fat loss can really happen almost immediately within a few weeks. So if you're doing these things, you're making those changes, I would suggest seeing an RD or visiting with a practitioner who can help after about a month. Again, it doesn't hurt to try these things before you go to a practitioner, because the more information you come with, the more they're going to be able to help you. So if you have really precise data about exactly what you're eating, they can look at that and give you a more tailored plan. So again, try all of these things first and then go see a provider if you're still struggling. So based on all of this, should you train based on your body type or on your somatotype? No, training based on your somatotype is largely antiquated and not very useful. Train based on you. Tweak things until you find what works, instead of trying to classify yourself into a category in which isn't very scientifically valid and may not be the right ingredients for success for you specifically in the phase of life that you're in. I hope this was helpful. We'll see you all next week. Same time, same place. Bye for now.